this conversation further with the Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, to also share his thoughts and findings on this drop on inflation, especially year on year, which is what we saw. Mr. Chukwu, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great, Mr. Johnson. So were you expecting this huge drop? I mean, almost 2%. That's a big difference.
No, I think it was quite steep. I didn't expect it to be that steep. I expected we would have further moderation. My projection was around 16.5%. So I didn't expect we are going to have at one at 16.05%, coming down almost 200 basis points from where we were in September of about 18.02%. So I think that's quite steep. But if you look at those factors that drove down inflation, I think the core change was in food inflation. I think you need to change the figures you're projecting. The food inflation was about 13.12% in October. So we saw a material decline in food inflation in October, principally because we are still in harvest season. If you look at the food index, you observe that the food inflation index actually, compared to October last year, declined by 0.37%. So we saw a reduction in food prices, which means we are seeing a deflation of food prices. And that happens because when the harvest season, we now have multiplicity of food items that are produced, including things like maize that are some households that cannot afford rice are now consuming. So I think the major factor that drove that is food inflation. Of course, we've seen some stability in the exchange rate, which had helped to moderate core inflation.
So FDC, Financial Services Company, is projecting that by the next month, and that's for November, that we will see a hike, maybe even if it's slight, because, you know, this takes us back to about a year ago during the rebasing, because the base year also has something to do with all of this. Do you also agree that because of the rebased year that's being used, we most likely will see an increase for November numbers?
Yeah, bear in mind that the rebasing, what they did for what they're doing this year is that they are using the average inflation figure for last year. An average inflation figure for last year was 33.18%. What that means is that every figure we are computing for this year is based on the average for last year. So I don't think, because they are using the average for last year, the month-on-month inflation figure may not materially affect the all-item inflation or the inflation figure that we're going to see in subsequent months, because they did not use subsequent, they didn't just adjust the figure for last year and use subsequent month-on-month as basis to compare, year on year as basis to compare annual inflation. They are now using the average of last year, which, like I said, is 33.18%. So that may smoothen up the impact of the year-on-year impact on inflation. So, but that does not take away the fact that it is possible the inflationary pressure will come up again as we move out of the harvest season. Like I said, the major driver of what we're seeing is food inflation, that we're seeing a deflation, which means price levels are coming down when it comes to food items. If you even look at an item like rice, you observe that the price of rice has consistently come down. I mean, we're now doing a bag of rice about 72,000 naira. They had gone above 100,000 naira. I mentioned the issues around maize, and a lot of the food crops that we produce are produced around this time. So that, as we move towards a planting season, the availability of these food items will dry up because we don't have preservation capabilities. We don't have silos where they are stored and we can have steady supply. So when we go past the harvest season, the supply will thin out and then prices could go up. So I think as we move towards a planting season, the price of food items will begin to inch up, and that could affect food inflation, which is the biggest basket. Bear in mind that based on the base figures, food and non-alcoholic beverages account for about 40% of the GDP of the inflation index, followed by items like transport, items like accommodation and restaurant. So, but the biggest contributor or biggest share of inflation is food and non-alcoholic beverages account for about 40%. So once you see an uptick in food items, we're going to likely see an uptick in all item inflation.
I was thinking, what about petrol? That also seems to run round for majority of Nigerians.
Yes, if you look at even petrol and you look at the segment where that has impact, it has impact on transportation. And we saw an increase in transportation about 1.7% in the month of October. That is year on year, which is comparing what the prices were as at end of average of last year and prices were at the end of October, in the month of October. So we saw an increase of about 1.7%. Same with food items. If you compare the food inflation, food and non-alcoholic beverages, you had about 6.4% increase year on year. But ultimately, the impact of petroleum products will dovetail in increase in transport costs. And because after the initial adjustment, it came down, but give and take, we still saw an uptick in transportation over the past 1 year. I mean, when you look at year-on-year inflation as of October.
So with this now, I mean, do you see another cut? Next week is MPC.
You know, interestingly, the MPC has a bit conflicted data they have to deal with. One, we are seeing a moderation in inflation rate, but on the other side, we are seeing pressure on exchange rates. And so they have to balance the need to support economic activities by cutting and the risk of a further up pressure on exchange rates. So I think they will now be caught between, if we cut on a core benchmark rate, are we going to see additional pressure on the exchange rate? And that might deter them from any adjustment. So I think we may end up seeing an MPC meeting that will come with a decision to hold rates at the current levels.
And you know, CPP also drew our attention to something else, that even though we see declining inflation, the cost of living is still high. The issue of welfare is also, and the level of poverty measured by bodies like the World Bank is not declining. So I guess that the numbers have not spread, you know, to every sector of the economy yet.
You know, the reality is that if you look at household income, even at 16.05%, over the past 22 months, household income on average has been eroded by about 49%. Bear in mind that the basis of the inflation computation is about 33.18% for last year's average. And then we have 16%, 16.05%. If you add the two, you're going to have something like 39.07%, which is almost 50%. So it simply means that average household needed to have had their income increased by 50% for them to be able to consume what we are consuming in December 2023. So if that is the case, how many households have gotten a 50% increase in their household income? So as long as you now achieve that, your standard of living had actually worsened over the past 22 months because your purchasing power has been eroded by about 50%. And that's why most households are still not feeling the impact of this deceleration inflation rate.
Mr. Chukwu, I know it will be very difficult. I mean, if we expect household income to increase by 50%, where do we trace that source to? Do we trace it to employers who also have overhead costs increasing, or do we trace it to sales when we know that disposable income has also reduced? So from your view, we've been having this conversation of how to bring the micro and the macro achievement together. So now we're seeing impressive macro data, but the micro is still lagging behind. How do we bring the macro up to where the micro up to where the macro is?
I think the best thing is that we need to focus on the heavy lifting. You know, the truth is that the micro, the household income and the standard of living will naturally lag behind the macro economic data. Of course, the macroeconomic factors partly drive the micro. So we need to have consistent improvement in the level of productive activities, consistent improvement in level of employment opportunities, so that you're going to have households that have multiple income from members of the household. So you also need to have a situation where the real sector of the economy is growing and faster than the current growth rate, and while inflation continues to moderate. So it's only when we have consistent moderating inflation as well as opportunities for employment, which will give the employees the bargaining power. Today, the employees in Nigeria do not have the bargaining power because they can't negotiate higher wages when there is high level of unemployment. So that's what we get when we're going to begin to narrow that gap in terms of performance of the macroeconomy as well as the performance of the micro, that is households and the firms. So, but the key thing is that we must maintain a positive trajectory, which is if we see inflation moderating, you get to a point where the inflation rate will be at a level that increase in household income will catch up. But to drive household income, we need to create employment. We need to be a productive economy that people have choices. Employees, people with skill will be in a position to bargain and get the right remuneration. And then at that point, we begin to have labor union that will be saying, look, we need to index increase in salaries to inflation, because now we can't do that. In other countries, they do that. As inflation is increasing, the index changes in your remuneration to change in price levels so that you're not worse off if price levels are increasing.
So, I mean, all of this now, I guess at the heart of it, we have the reforms which President Bola Tinubu is pushing. We've had a lot of praises, but of course we also had some knocks. Which way do you think this reform should go now to maybe accelerate this need to balance the households and the bigger picture, that's the macro?
I think the reforms need to now focus on sectors of the economy that has capacity to grow, areas we have comparative advantage. And I believe that there are several sectors. Take, for instance, solid minerals. We need to do everything to formalize the solid mineral sector and increase our export commodities beyond crude. That is a low-hanging fruit because we have the solid minerals beneath the ground. Then we need to look at other sectors where we can quickly, the agricultural sector, where we can increase the level of beneficiation, the level of transformation of raw materials into some level of semi-finished or finished goods. So we don't continue to export raw food items. That is also a low-hanging fruit. And then we also need to improve on our ability to store. Look at, for instance, tomato. We produce a lot of it, but you have very few companies that are actually transforming tomato into tin tomato in such a way that you can store it for a long period of time. But what we have, we produce and we waste the next day because we don't have the capacity to store it. So we need to improve on some of these things. Improve on sectors like agriculture, that we have the entire value chain in our agriculture sector. We don't just produce cocoa, seed, focus, and I mentioned agriculture. And then those sectors, they will incentivize operators in that sector, and that incentive will help those people to invest in those sectors and improve productivity. We have proof of concept. We have done it in cement, and it has been successful. So we can repeat in other sectors where we have comparative advantage.
Well, I mean, Mr. Chukwu, these are ideas that have been bantered round. You know, it's not new. So I don't know if there's anything new we could be doing. We've talked about the potentials in Nigeria's agriculture, value addition, value chain. You just talked then when we were talking about the inflation numbers of why prices are low now, but in a couple of months, we can't expect it to remain low. And that's because of the lack of preservation and storage systems, you know, that would preserve some of these things. So, I mean, these ideas are not new. Sometimes one wonders what's holding the government, the private sector, what's holding us back?
Well, that's why they say talk is cheap. Action is a problem. And we also say the devil is in the details. In the government, I mean, these things are, like they say, open secret that we can do these things. And I use the proof of concept. I didn't use the case of cement. We've always had limestone in the country since God created the world. But it took the government to come up with a policy to incentivize people to go into cement production, for the likes of Dangote, the likes of Bua and others to go into strong cement production. And when we are becoming a net exporter of cement. It's just what the government can do. It's government to decide that we want to focus on this area and then come up with the right policies, come up with the right incentives, and come up with the right deterrents for people that don't want to comply with the government policies. And then follow through the implementation without any deviation. We did it in telecommunication sector, from 450,000 active lines to over almost 200 million lines today. But key thing is that we must know that economic development, particularly this sector development, is driven by policies of government, including use of fiscal tools, tax holidays, tax incentives, to drive, and then trade policies that will create necessary barrier if need be, that will drive economic agents to go into those sectors. We can do it in agriculture sector, we can do it in solid mineral. I said today, I mean, I was looking at the map of Nigeria's solid mineral deposit. We have almost everything. But then what we have in Zamfara is that we have the highest level of insecurity because we have artisanal mining where bandits are the one mining what the government should have created structures to mine and export. We have a lot of granite. Are we cutting the granite and refining it? No, we're not. Sometimes we cut the granite and export the raw granite to Italy and they refine and we put at a very huge cost. But the government can create the incentive and would encourage people to go and set up the necessary equipment to refine those, to cut and refine those granites.
Well, I guess the demand is very much. Maybe that's why, because I know that when it comes to solid minerals, Minister Alake was very heavy when he just came in, talking about the illegal mining and curbing all of that, dealing with arresting even illegal miners. But I guess it's a huge work to do, and so we'll still have to give him some time, or give the ministry some time, so we can see some of those. But the unfortunate thing is the illegal miners or the illegal actors are not waiting for us. They're exploiting, you know, all of these things that we have, especially at this time when we have renewable energy in the air, and we have the potential to produce a lot of them. Unfortunately, those things are being stolen or lying fallow somewhere in the northern part of the country especially.
Yes, that's why I said it's not that this is impossible to do. We have countries that are building, like you just said, building huge solar farms. And if you look at the northern part of the country, we can actually set up solar farms in the northern part and generate enough power, like they're doing in China, that generate enough power that even feed the entire north. And we have gas deposits in the south. So what are we doing with it? It beggars logic that we still don't have enough power supply. And that is very critical for us to be a productive economy, because you must energy, everything that functions, including you and I, function based on the supply of energy. So we must, as part of those process of transforming the economy, focus on investing appropriately in the energy sector to generate enough power supply, to transmit enough power supply, and to distribute enough power supply. But even the island mode generation, the solar generated power, we have enough sunlight, to be able to be generating enough power to supply the country and even sell to neighboring country. But unfortunately, these things will be driven by right incentives, right policies that will encourage you and I to say, look, this is a good area to invest. Without policies, nobody will invest blindly.
All right, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, thank you so much for your time on the program and sharing your views. Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Limited.
Thank you for having me.